Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ford Presidential Library. My name is Elaine Didier, and I have the pleasure of going back and forth between Grand Rapids and Ann Arbor to our two facilities, the museum in Grand Rapids and the library here, of course. We're very pleased to have you here for this second program of our winter season, and maybe on the night that winter might actually come and find us. Our program, as usual, is being taped by Michigan Productions, and it will be shown on Ann Arbor Cable in the coming weeks. So when we get to the question and answer period at the end of the program, you'll note that we have a microphone at the back of the center aisle, and we'd appreciate it if you went to the mic to ask your question so that everyone watching it on cable can hear your questions as well. And finally, the standard housekeeping reminder, if your cell phone is not already turned off, would you please do so at this time. Tonight's program is brought to you with the support of the National Archives and Records Administration, which is our parent organization, and also with the support of the Ford Presidential Foundation. Our executive director, Joe Calvaruso, was here for the day, but had to head back. He lives near Kalamazoo, and with the weather coming in, he decided that it wasn't a good idea to be leaving here at 10 o'clock at night. So we're sorry you won't have a chance to meet him tonight, but he comes periodically. Tonight's program is one of my favorite features of the educational programming we offer here at the library and museum because it's another lecture featuring a winner of the Gerald Ford Prize for Distinguished Reporting on National Defense. There's another prize for reporting on the presidency. This award, or both awards, have been given annually for 24 years at a June event at the National Press Club in Washington. While the stipend for the award is sponsored by the Gerald Ford Presidential Foundation, selection of the winner is made by an entirely independent panel of journalists and university faculty. I've been told by various winners that they view this award as the Academy Awards of Journalism. In winning the 2011 prize for reporting on national defense, Shane Harris joins the distinguished company of prior winners, ranging from Greg Jaffe and Rick Atkinson of the Washington Post, James Kitfield of the National Journal, and Michael Duffy of Time. That's not bad company. Shane Harris is senior writer for the Washingtonian, which is described as the magazine Washington lives by. I think actually calling it a magazine maybe isn't quite the right phrase. Washingtonian is a 5-time National Magazine Award winner for its reporting and writing, and Shane told us over dinner that he will spend up to 3 months on one of his longer pieces, which is an amazing amount of time in today's changing world of journalism. Mr. Harris has spent the last decade writing about national security and counterterrorism. Prior to joining Washingtonian in 2010, he was staff correspondent for the National Journal for 5 years, and before that post, he was technology editor and staff correspondent at Government Executive, the premier publication covering management in the federal government. In 2011, Mr. Harris was awarded the Gerald Ford Prize for Distinguished Reporting on National Defense during the year 2010. The judges for this award felt, and I quote, "The body of work submitted showcased some of the most important cross-cutting issues and challenges of our times, often writing about issues with which the nation is still coming to grips. Topics included the standards of warfare in an age of technology developments and the nation's struggle to manage the information needed to prevent future attacks." The judges also noted that his writing maintained a fair and balanced approach on topics that are often highly polarized, and I think you'll hear more about that tonight. In addition to the Ford Award, Mr. Harris received the Bernstein Book Award for Excellence in Journalism by the New York Public Library and has 3 times been named a finalist for the prestigious Livingston Awards for Young Journalists. He's a graduate of Wake Forest University with a degree in politics and is the author of The Watchers, The Rise of American Surveillance State, voted one of 2010's best books by The Economist. Please welcome Shane Harris to our podium.
Thank you so much. Thank you. With that introduction, I suppose we can just wrap it up. Thank you very much. That's very nice. And thank you to all you intrepid souls for coming out here tonight on what I understand is the first real snow that you guys have had here in Michigan, or at least in these parts. It's very good to be in Michigan, where the National Political Circus has relocated from its normal headquarters in my hometown of Washington, D.C. I'm glad you could take it over for a while. It was amusing. I was sitting in my hotel room before coming over and saw something on TV that I don't see in Washington, which are political ads, we don't see them, and we have our one tiny electoral vote, and Republicans are an endangered species in the district. So I have not really been exposed to these, but it's fun to be here this time. It's interesting that you mentioned the awards being sort of like the Academy Awards for journalism. It is true, definitely, among defense reporters for sure, that winning this award really is sort of a great achievement, and you always aspire to it. And it's funny with the Oscars on Sunday. I was thinking, you kind of hear these stories about people who, they find out that they were nominated because somebody calls them at 4 o'clock in the morning and says, "You're nominated for the Oscar." And, they oftentimes say they feel like it was a joke, like somebody was playing a prank on them. So that was me, actually, when I got the call about the Ford Prize. And Joe, who couldn't be here, actually was the one who called up. And, I got this phone call. I'm sitting at my office desk, and someone calls up and says, "Well, you know that you were nominated for the Ford Prize." And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Well, I'd like to tell you that you won." Feeling very composed and eloquent, my response was, "What?" And I truly thought for a moment that it was somebody playing a joke on me, because the editors in our magazine have a practical joke tradition that often lands on my doorstep. But it was an extreme honor, really, really was. And so I'm very pleased to be here tonight. And what I'm going to talk about this evening draws a lot on the stories that I wrote that were part of the package that was awarded the Ford Prize. So I'm going to start this conversation, which is broadly titled "The New Cold War," which is sort of a paradigm that I am working through and thinking out as a journalist and a thinker about national security topics. But I want to start this with sort of stepping back in time, for a little bit in recent history, with a premise. I start with the idea, and it might be kind of controversial to some, that the war on terror, or the war on terrorism, whichever form you like, is over, and we won. I think that if you want two neat bookends of what sort of marks off this period in history, you can start with the attacks of 9/11, and you can end officially with the killing of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan last year. I think those two data points sort of mark the beginning and the end of the war on terrorism as the central animating principle or concept, if you like, that drove so much of our national security posture for the past 10 years. The Defense Department referred to it as the Global War on Terror, or GWAT. You would see it in documents. It was a real thing. It wasn't just a rhetorical device. And it was the center of action of so much of military and security policy. I think it's effectively over. I actually think that it didn't end with bin Laden. I think it was actually on the way out before that. When I noticed the beginning of the end of it actually was Hurricane Katrina in 2005. I can remember being a Homeland Security reporter at the time at National Journal, and having spent about 4 years since 9/11 up to that time, hearing how this new Homeland Security apparatus that we were setting up after the 9/11 attacks was going to keep us safe from man-made disasters and natural ones as well. And when this extraordinary natural disaster came along, this entire apparatus that we had set up to deal with it just seemed completely inapt and unable to deal with it. And I think we can all remember that just sort of awful sinking feeling of, what is our government doing and where have our priorities been? And I could really feel, especially in Washington in policy circles, you could sort of feel this sense creeping in that maybe our priorities were in the wrong place, but even if they weren't, that this endless war on terror was simply not sustainable. And I think it took a while, but by the time that we went into the surge in Iraq and there was a sense of the wars drawing down, and by the time that Obama took office, it was clear to me, and I think some of my colleagues are reporting on this stuff, that we're heading towards a point where the war on terror is no longer the central animating thing. Obama took office in 2008 and pretty quickly pivoted towards what becomes the counter-terrorism strategy that we have today, which is largely defined by using drones and special operations forces to go into remote places that we don't want to put armies, and to hunt down people and to kill them. That is essentially what the counterterrorism policy is abroad. And the United States is very good at that. Obama launched more drone strikes in 2008 than George Bush did in all 8 years of his presidency, probably 2009, I'm sorry. It's kind of become the long pole in the tent, if you like, of counterterrorism strategy. And then with the death of bin Laden, we're kind of moving away from that now. So what replaces the war on terror, or if you like, the global war on terror as this sort of central theme for security policy? And I think it is that we are in these early days now of what I call this new Cold War. And the way I look at it is, broadly speaking, like this. I think that in the years to come, conflicts among nations or conflicts among nations and organized groups are going to be taking place in places that we have not traditionally recognized as battlefields, and using weapons and technology that are still relatively new to us, and that as they evolve will move beyond our control. So I take these two big threads, and that's what I'll talk about tonight. The first I'll look at is the battlefields, the spaces where conflict is occurring, and increasingly we're seeing cyberspace, the internet, the World Wide Web, the network connection that binds us and undergirds our social organization and commerce and communication as becoming a domain of strategic importance to the United States. And I'll talk about weapons primarily by focusing on drones, which have become such an extraordinarily important part, not just of counterterrorism, but of military strategy going forward. So first let's talk about cyberspace. It is the case right now that the Obama administration views cyberspace as a strategic domain. And what I mean is that's a place where countries and organizations and groups are battling each other for control, much the same way that the military views land and sea and air and outer space. The military actually refers to cyberspace as a fifth domain, and the one that is uncontested, that is up for grabs, that anybody with the technology and the will could come in and assert themselves and control it. Increasingly, the military is being called upon to defend that space, not just as it concerns its own information infrastructure, but the rest of the civilian infrastructure as well. And when the president deems necessary in the future, they will likely be called upon to conduct offensive operations in that space. This is a big abstract idea that's sometimes kind of hard to wrap your head around because we don't see the internet. So let me tell you sort of a series of stories that explain how it is that cybersecurity became what is really right now probably the fastest growing sort of preoccupation in national security circles, and one that is really getting a lot of traction in Washington now. You go back to May 2007, actually, in the closing years of the Bush administration, and there was a meeting in May 2007 in the Oval Office with the president and most of the upper echelon of his national security team. There you had Mike McConnell, who was the director of national intelligence at the time. Vice President Cheney was there, Secretary Gates was there, Steve Hadley, who was the national security advisor, Hank Paulson, who was the Treasury Secretary at the time. All these people were in this room for a meeting that Mike McConnell had convened to talk about strategy in Iraq. We were heading into the surge. And Bush gave McConnell an hour for this meeting. And in 15 minutes, McConnell had basically gotten everything he needed from the president. It had gone much faster than he thought. And he had 45 minutes left on the table with, what am I going to talk about? We've got the entire National Security Council here. This better be good. McConnell in a previous life was the director of the National Security Agency, which is the government's electronic eavesdropping arm, and is intimately involved in protecting information networks. They do cybersecurity, right? McConnell had been tuned into this idea for a long time before he became the National Intelligence Director that the nation's information networks were vulnerable to penetration from outsiders, to hackers, to spies who would get into them and steal information, possibly classified information from the government, possibly getting into the systems of individuals, of corporations, things that we're pretty familiar with right now. McConnell was sort of spotting this back in the mid-90s. And he realized that Bush, like all the presidents before him, frankly, really had not grasped the nature of this threat. It is the case that, up until Obama, I don't think that a president even had a computer in the Oval Office. It's something that they're quite distanced from. I think Bush talked about the Google, which is, no dig on him in particular, but, so they don't spend their days surfing online, and now, Obama has a BlackBerry and a Twitter account. It's a different kind of reality. But, McConnell decided to take this moment to say to the president, okay, look, I've got his attention, all the big players in the room, I'm going to drive home to him that cyber is this thing we've got to start paying attention to. So he says to him, Mr. President, let me paint you a picture. Imagine if on 9/11 we were attacked not by terrorists in airplanes flying into buildings, but by outside hackers who broke into the databases of a major U.S. bank and manipulated or deleted the data such that that bank could not process and close transactions, and a ripple effect sort of comes out from there, and key pillars of the information infrastructure of the financial system start falling away because there's no confidence in them or the data's gone. He said in a situation like this, the economic consequences would have been manifestly greater than the economic consequences of the physical attack. on 9/11, which were quite significant and aggravated an already inflamed recession. Bush looks really incredulous when McConnell tells him this. He's like, what are you talking about? And so he's mentioning banks, so he turns to Hank Paulson, and he says, Hank, is this true? And the Treasury Secretary says, well, Mr. President, not only is it true, but when I was the CEO of Goldman Sachs, what he just said is the thing that kept me up at night, more than anything. That was the nightmare scenario among myself and the major CEOs of the big banks. And Bush is still sort of incredulous about this and saying, no, wait, what are you talking about? They can get into our computers. I mean, what, they could get into our computers here in the White House? And he points over to his desk and he points to his secure phone. He says, they could get into that phone on my desk. And there's this kind of silent moment, and they kind of look at some of the advisors look at each other, and then one of them speaks up and says, Mr. President, we have to presume that if the capability to do that exists, that people are trying to do it. And Bush, President of the United States, pushes himself back from the table and stands up and proclaims to this room, the internet, cyberspace, is our strategic advantage for the next century, and we have to do everything we can to protect it. And he looks at McConnell and says, Mike, you brought this in here, you've got 30 days to fix it. So, yeah, 30 days later he didn't fix it, not to spoil the story. But, so that story was described to me by a number of people, including McConnell, who were in that room, and it was this really pivotal moment. And it starts off this whole sort of chain of events of senior people in the US government, in the military and the intelligence community really starting to get focused around this problem, which was not a new problem, mind you, but it had never broken through to high levels in government where someone could do something about it. The immediate impact of this was McConnell, I guess, sort of sensing that he better make some progress in the next 30 days. The Pentagon, actually, which, not surprisingly, has a big presence online and depends on networks for its global communications, started monitoring places on the internet where its own internal networks started connecting with the outside networks. So sort of like off-ramps on the information superhighway that went to the Pentagon. They started watching those because that's their property, effectively. But not watching them so much for attacks coming at them or intrusion attempts coming at them, but looking for attempts and viruses and what's called malware that they thought were being directed towards other pieces of critical U.S. infrastructure, banks, power grids, other places that depend on the internet. So it's a very interesting dynamic where the Pentagon is not exactly monitoring the internet to look after hackers trying to get into banks and other places, but it's sort of watching its own bypass lane on the internet for what's coming through its gateways that it might have a chance to alert people to. This goes on for about a year or so, and about a year after the Oval Office meeting, there's this other hair-raising meeting that starts to really focus the attention, this time not in government but in private industry. So one day, the Deputy Secretary of Defense has over some of the CEOs from the biggest defense contractors in Washington, all names that you've heard of, who build the weapons systems and the computer systems for the government, and brings them into a secure facility at the Pentagon. All of them are granted temporary security clearances, and they are shown a demonstration that reveals that over the previous year, there have been systematic attempts, sometimes successful, by groups presumably based in China to get into their networks to steal classified government information that they have because they are working under contract to the government. And in one of the cases that was well publicized about this, hackers, again, the presumption is in China at this point, stole information about the Joint Strike Fighter. This is the new 21st century warfighting plane. Particularly stealing information that could make it easier for adversaries to defend against the airplane. So you can see why another nation would be interested in countermeasures against this plane. So basically the Pentagon shows this list of horrors to these CEOs. And what I'm told by somebody who's familiar with the meeting is that a lot of people went in with dark hair and came out with white hair. And the Pentagon essentially says to them, this is a problem. You have to fix it if you want to continue doing business with the United States government. And applies leverage and creates something that becomes known as the Defense Industrial Base Initiative. It's often shorthand referred to as the DIB. Washington, great for acronyms. I'll throw a few more out before we're done. But essentially, it is kind of a cone of silence in which these big companies are working with each other and sharing information with each other and with the government and as close to real time as possible about the vulnerabilities on their networks, the kinds of things they see coming at them, where those people might be, what people seem to want to be stealing. And the idea here is that if they all sort of collectively start talking to each other about what they're seeing, that they can all elevate their defense posture, in kind. It's sort of a rising tides philosophy. That program is going forward now. It took a year just to get the legal memoranda sorted out, because you're talking about dealing in proprietary information to these companies. These companies do not want to advertise what their vulnerabilities are on their networks. That makes them a target. For those that are traded publicly, I'm sure their shareholders would not be really keen to know how easy it is to steal classified information from their databases. So this sort of program set up as a way for government and the industry to start cooperating in protecting the internet, essentially. Not the whole internet, but a piece of it, a piece of this infrastructure. That program has since moved over to the Homeland Security Department, which by law has the responsibility to work with industry to establish protections for what's called critical infrastructure, banks, power grids, electrical facilities, and the like, all of which are in some way attached to the internet for their command and control systems. So you can start to see how this policy is moving out of the government paying attention to its own backyard and starting to help with the private sector, all because of this view of cyberspace as a strategic domain. Obama comes in and really gets this, I think, pretty deeply. He gives a speech in May 2009 at the White House, which I attended, in which he does something that no president up to that point had ever done. He doesn't come out and name names and name countries, but he comes out and says in this speech, which was a preview of the National Cybersecurity Strategy, such that it is, it's a fairly thin document, and says, we now have evidence that foreign organizations have penetrated the systems that control electrical power facilities in the United States. He doesn't say anybody caused a blackout. He just says, we know that people have been probing those systems, sort of casing the house, if you like. This was an extraordinary moment, not because no one had ever said it, but no one had ever said it on the record, and certainly the President of the United States had never acknowledged it. I had been reporting for a couple of years before this, talking to unnamed intelligence officials, people who were sort of warning that this was happening, that people are looking at the power grid, we have to be aware of this. And now the President is saying it. It was a really tremendous escalation. Why did Obama appreciate this threat so much and really sort of get it, maybe even in a way that Bush didn't get it? Obviously, he's very internet savvy. I mean, his whole campaign organization was largely based and mobilized off the internet. But what's interesting is that the first person who ever gave Obama an insight into what the government knew about cyberspace was Mike McConnell. It was the guy who gave Bush the meeting in the Oval Office in 2007. McConnell gave Obama a briefing after he had become the Democratic nominee. There's a new policy in place in which the Republican and Democratic nominees before the election are given a preliminary classified intelligence briefing. It's not the book of secrets, right? It's not everything, but it's enough to get them prepared for what they may be dealing with if they win the election. And McConnell went to Chicago and in a secure facility gave Obama this briefing, which included largely an overview of counterterrorism operations around the world, which impressed the president quite a bit, and then also gave him his sort of presentation on cybersecurity. And as McConnell told me about a year or two after that, he said, the president looked at me and said, before you came here today, I'd been worried about losing the election, and now I'm afraid of winning. He kind of got a sense of what was in store for him. So you come into the early days of the administration. They're really kind of, raising the awareness of this. Still reluctant, though, to come out and start naming countries that are behind this. Well, that problem sort of gets not solved, but kind of half solved in January 2010 when Google, we all know who Google is, comes out and says publicly that they have evidence that hackers in China have been accessing Gmail accounts and trying to steal proprietary algorithms of Google's search engine tool. Again, an extraordinary event, not because this was the first time anybody had ever suspected Chinese cyber spies or industrial spies of trying to steal intellectual property, but because someone was saying it, and it was Google. This was a huge, huge moment. And what I'm told from sources who are familiar with it is this actually took the administration by surprise somewhat. It sort of accelerated the momentum towards the administration, I think, having to finally come out and sort of take a position on this and name names, which eventually they did in November of 2011. The office that is responsible for monitoring how foreign spies are trying to target U.S. industry and government came out with a report that officially said, we believe that sources in Russia and in China, mostly in China, are behind a systematic, widespread campaign of organized crime on the internet and industrial espionage against US companies, and it has real impact. You're stealing secrets from companies, you're leaping ahead of them technologically, you're undermining world trade agreements, the whole thing. They really kind of came out with this pretty damning report and named names, and that was really remarkable. And I wrote about this at the time, and I said this was sort of like the internet's Iron Curtain moment, because it conjured up, Churchill giving this speech where he's sort of coming out and almost naming and shaming all of the forces that he sees aligning against the West. I think from the administration's perspective, it sort of had to be done. It was becoming such a joke that nobody wanted to say publicly, China stopped doing this. For a lot of reasons, diplomatic reasons. China's a very large investor in the United States. Same goes with Russia in that our relationship with them is not great. Why antagonize it? But we sort of crossed that line, and it is sort of the stated policy now that the U.S. government blames these countries for, if not exactly being behind it themselves, for tolerating the activity inside their country against the U.S. So I think what's going to happen now is you're going to see more of a momentum going in this direction. You've got naming China and Russia, you've got information being shared with defense contractors, the intelligence community being very vocal about the threat that they see in cyberspace. Recently we saw a development in which the intelligence community is going to start sharing information with banks and folks on Wall Street about targeted threats against the financial system. Again, it's another extension, it's another step forward. First we start with the defense contractors, now we're moving on to banks. You'll start seeing the label critical infrastructure thrown against a lot of sectors in the economy, which I think will kind of be a way for the government to say it's time for us to step in now and help you improve security. And what I think this is ultimately going to culminate in is an alliance between government and industry, or if you like, the military and industry, that is of a degree that is unlike anything that we have seen since the Second World War. There is a whole sort of cyber-industrial complex that will begin to get set up. And the reason for this really has to do with the fact that no one really owns the internet. No one controls it. The government cannot go out and flip a switch and say it's protected now. Most of the networks in this country are privately owned. The government knows it cannot defend this space unless industry is helping it or unless industry is forced to do what it wants. This is going to be a very uneasy alliance because these two sides don't really trust each other all that much. Industry is happy to help the government when everything is written down and legal and it's reviewed and there are no secrets being kept from them. You'll remember back in 2005, the New York Times broke a story about warrantless wiretapping by the National Security Agency. It was news to a lot of the companies that were helping the NSA that this might not be exactly legal. They were given lots of assurances that it was, and you'll recall that many of those companies were sued by their customers. So industry is not really keen on jumping into a whole new big, let's protect the internet with government unless they have real assurances that everything is above board. And for its part, government doesn't exactly trust industry either. Industry likes to keep secrets. They've kept a lot of secrets when it comes to cybersecurity. And, they are a source of tremendous leaks. So from that perspective, they're a little bit inclined not to tell them everything that they know. But I think that there can be no doubt that this sort of convergence is coming. And I was struck by a quote recently, which I'll read to you, that gives you a sense of how other world powers outside the United States are viewing this emergence of cyberspace as this strategic, highly militarized, often space. This is the quote. "High-precision, long-range conventional weapons will become increasingly common. An important, if not decisive, role in determining the nature of armed conflict will be played by the military capability of a country to counter space or information-related threats, especially in cyberspace." Does anybody want to guess who said that? I'll give you a hint. I had to translate it, or someone had to translate it. That was Vladimir Putin, the Prime Minister of Russia, writing in a Russian newspaper this week. Okay, so turning away from the battlefield part of this new Cold War, I want to talk a bit about the weapons, the technology. I talked about drones earlier and how President Obama has deployed them in Pakistan and they've become sort of this pillar of counterterrorism strategy. The military, I should note, does not like the word drone. They really bristle at it when you bring it up. They prefer terms like unmanned aerial vehicle, or UAV. If you work for the Air Force, it's called an RPA, which is a remote piloted aircraft. And they don't like the word drone because, understandably from their perspective, they say drone conjures up this image of something menacing or really something dumb, something without a mind of its own that is somehow beyond the control of human beings who are at the stick. That's actually precisely why I like the term, because I think that's kind of where drones are heading. So follow me on this. I think in the near future, and I would count that as within the next 10 to 20 years, drones are going to become, whether they're in the air or on land or in the water, by the way, are going to become less and less dependent upon human beings to the point that they're actually autonomous or very close to autonomous, capable of carrying out military missions without being directed by a human being. Now, lest this sounds like science fiction, I'm going to read you some stats that I've collected from the past 60 years of the history of human beings' connection to armed conflict, particularly in the air, and see where this trend goes. In World War II, it took a fleet of 1,000 B-17 bombers that were flown, navigated, and manned by 10-man crews, so 10,000 people in 1,000 planes, to destroy a single-axis ground target. And American bombs were so imprecise that on average, only 1 in 5 fell within 1,000 feet of where it was actually aimed. So the aerial campaign was a clumsy affair. It was utterly dependent on the extraordinary labor of human beings. One generation later, that's not true anymore. In the Vietnam War, it took 30 F-4 fighter bombers, each flown and navigated by only 2 men, to destroy a target. That's a 99.4% reduction in the number of people to destroy a target. Huge, in one generation of air war. The precision of that attack was also greatly enhanced by the first widespread use of laser-guided munitions. After Vietnam, humans' connection to air war becomes even more attenuated and actually less relevant. In the Gulf War, one pilot flying one plane could hit 2 targets. And the effectiveness of this human-machine pairing, if you like, was really quite breathtaking. A single smart bomb could do the work of 1,000 planes dropping more than 9,000 bombs in World War II, if you're measuring for accuracy. Single smart bomb. By the time the U.S. goes to war in Afghanistan and Iraq, one pilot in one plane can destroy 6 targets. And the weapons are being guided now by global positioning satellites orbiting thousands of miles above the Earth. That's where we've come since World War II, in a fairly short amount of time. It's astounding technological change. And of course, now what we're seeing is planes conducting missions in which the pilots actually aren't inside the aircraft. You've seen the pictures of the drone pilots out like in bases in Nevada, sitting in these sort of disembodied cockpits looking like a video game. The historical trend here is really sobering. As technology evolves, human beings are becoming less essential to the conduct of warfare. Soon I think that we're not going to have pilots, but actually controllers that are sitting more like at screens with keyboards and giving sort of broad general commands, not to one drone, but maybe half a dozen drones, who will then go out and go to a target and survey it or possibly engage it. They're going to have to be able to communicate with each other, the drones, so they don't fly into each other, so they know how to evade an adversary if it comes after them. Soon we'll be having software that can determine what is the optimal attack strategy on this target. Well, the drone knows. The drone's right there. Let the drone figure it out. This is actually documented. If you look in Air Force research, this is sort of the trend of where they want to go. By the year 2047, the Air Force has stated publicly, and I think it'll happen sooner than this, it imagines drones operating in what it calls swarms. So dozens, potentially more than 100 drones, maybe of the size that we see now, maybe the size of insects, that essentially that go off on a mission and don't really need to communicate with us to fly. The drones just know how to do it. The technology to do this, I talked to an expert recently who I'm sitting with on a task force that is looking at sort of the future of unmanned weaponry. She estimated that reality could actually happen in 20 years. Not 2047, which is more like 30 years or so of the Air Force, but possibly in 20 years. And that what's inhibiting it is not so much the technology, but our willingness to unleash it in the world. And you're seeing this sort of some of these misgivings start to pronounce themselves now. Notably, it seems though not at the Air Force or in the military. There seems to be very much a rush towards developing the technology. And there's not really a great level of attention being paid to the legal and the moral and the ethical dimensions of this, much less the strategic dimensions of it. If we start to develop weapons that other people are then going to want to develop, obviously, too, that have these capabilities. There is a global proliferation right now of drones. There are probably about 50 countries, the estimates are right now, that have drones for surveillance purposes. Probably about a half a dozen have weaponized drones, and we, by far, lead the field in terms of the sophistication and the numbers of those drones. But other countries are building them too, and why wouldn't they? Not surprising. Who's fielding them? China. There was an air show in China about I think it was last year. There's a front page story in the Washington Post about this, and they've actually got some of the material online you can go and look at. But the Chinese, one of the manufacturers had displayed this model drone, which looked suspiciously like our drones too, but maybe that's just a coincidence. And it came with this video, this sort of rudimentary video that showed this drone flying around what suspiciously looks like a landmass shaped like Taiwan, launching a missile at what looks suspiciously like a U.S. aircraft carrier. And the message was very clear. It is, we have this technology that is an asymmetric response. You can put carrier battle groups in the Straits of Taiwan. We will develop drones to go and attack you. There's an inevitability about this, and there's a certain logic when you think about it from the point of view of the Chinese or any country that is staring at our ever-growing arsenal of drones that maybe one day are going to be able to go off and conduct robot wars on their own. So we have weapons that need us less and less. We have a battlefield in cyberspace in which people aren't actually fighting or aggravating each other face to face. So does that mean that in the future, in the next century, that humans won't actually fight wars with each other, but rather through these technological proxies? I think the answer to that is no. But we are going to see these tools, if you like, these domains, are going to be as much of a part of future wars as planes and tanks and bombs and guns are today. I actually think that Vladimir Putin had it mostly right, and I cannot believe I'm actually agreeing in public with Vladimir Putin, but that an important, if not decisive, role in determining the nature of armed conflict will be played in cyberspace. I think the same goes for drones, as if you think of them as sort of an advancing weapon. Look at drones, for instance. Already the nature of the drones themselves has drawn the parameters or the rules of war, if you like, around what we're doing in Pakistan. Absent drones that can fly into those regions and survey and target people and blow them up, we're not going to put ground forces in Pakistan to do that. So the presence of the technology enables a whole new kind of battle. So already you're seeing the influence of the technology on our strategy. The drones have the benefit of being remote, of being cheap, of posing minimal risk to our forces, and that can also, to a degree, be used to describe operations in cyberspace, particularly espionage operations, for which there is basically no recourse, and there are no consequences at this point. So I return to this frame of a new Cold War, and I think it works by comparison to the previous Cold War. Has many of the same dimensions. This is a strategic struggle over contested domains. It's conducted via proxies. It's heavily reliant on technologies, which we are trying to improve faster than our adversaries. And most important, I think, it is a possible preamble to face-to-face war. Make no mistake about this, and I want to be very clear in my view. Provocations among nations in cyberspace or robot battles that are fought in remote corners of the world where people don't go can and likely will, if they are not moderated, tip into the kind of war that humanity has long recognized and dreaded. I don't believe that conflicts in cyberspace or with drones will take the place of real war, if you like, nor do I think that they make those conflicts significantly less likely, but they are going to define our security posture for the foreseeable future, and indeed I think that they are the new realities of warfare in the 21st century. Thank you. So I'd be happy to take any of your questions, comments. There's a microphone in the back of the room.
Welcome to Ann Arbor.
Hi, thank you.
And you have totally scared me to death.
It happens, I'm sorry.
Just listening to you, Your early comments were just screaming of Eisenhower and that we should be afraid of the military-industrial complex. And then your drones start talking about or sounding like Darth Vader. And I'm thinking of that movie, War Games, where they were not able to stop this war computer. They couldn't convince it to stop. So on top of all of that, can you make me even feel even less secure about the power grid that we have? What can you say about protecting that? Because I think that if a power grid goes down, we will not only have the cyber panic, but we will have the physical panic of being in the dark and not having the things that we normally live with.
Okay. I want to say I love the War Games analogy, by the way, because in my mind it's a really good one. There's a scene actually in the movie where you've got Dabney Coleman plays the computer guy, and I forget the guy who plays the general. But they're trying to stop the computer from essentially launching the arsenal, and this general with this thick Texas accent says, "Just unplug the damn thing." And Dabney Coleman's like, "It doesn't work that way." So it really does kind of capture a lot of how these things actually work. Yeah, the power grid is the thing that everybody worries about, right? It's the nightmare scenario. The idea here is that electrical facilities are run using devices called SCADA systems, which are essentially command and control systems that in some cases are connected to the internet. And even if they're not connected to the internet, they are hooked up to networks that a sophisticated adversary could get inside to then take over and presumably shut the lights off. There are people who believe that it's happened. It's a big point of debate and contention. What can be done about it, I think depends a little bit on who you ask. But the going theory, I think, in Washington right now is that there may need to be some kind of new regulation for utility companies to improve the security of their systems. That's going to be very difficult to do because it's a fairly I'm not even familiar enough with electrical regulation to give it a good adjective, but I imagine it's probably fairly Byzantine and fairly layered. I think, though, if you're looking for like a bright spot in all of this as to why we not to worry about the power grid, there's a little bit of mutually assured destruction theory, I think, that runs through all of this in cyber war. And I've always thought that if the lights went off in San Francisco and we had a pretty good idea that it was someone in China that did it, there's going to be bombs going to Beijing very quickly. And I don't say that as like, oh my God, it's going to start a war, but I think that whoever would do something like that probably knows that our response is going to be severe and not simply based in the internet. One thing you've seen happening, a number of military officials have come out in recent months saying that they believe that a cyber attack, if you like that word, of the level of pulling down a power grid would justify a military response, what the military calls a kinetic response, which is a fun word too. But so I think that really what makes me sort of a little bit more optimistic about that is that I can't believe that one of our adversaries would be crazy enough to do it. Organized crime outfits. You may have seen the 60 Minutes did a show about a year ago, I think it was about a blackout in Brazil. And again, there are two schools of thought on whether it was actually caused by hackers, but their research suggested that it may have been a criminal group essentially holding people for ransom. There you're getting into, like, how do you counter that? Good question, I don't know. But if you're talking about just from a nation-state point of view, I mean, I would hope that the Chinese were not crazy enough to try and turn the lights off. Yes, sir.
I think you said, or you implied that U.S. drones are invading Pakistani airspace. And is that not, in some ways, a violation of their airspace, i.e. a declaration of war or such? And what would be our response if China sent drones over Washington, D.C., for example? Would that be an act of war that we would have to respond to?
Right. The question of the legality of the drone operations in Pakistan is a big one. I wrote, actually, one of the pieces that I wrote that was submitted to the Ford Foundation for the prize was about that very thing. The administration's point of view on this, and a lot of legal scholars point out, we're not at war with Pakistan, so how exactly is it that we're conducting offensive operations in Pakistan? One answer to that might be that the Pakistani government is consenting to these operations, maybe with a wink and a nod. There is some theory that would say that we're justified in doing it if we're chasing down legitimate combatants that the Pakistanis won't do anything about, so we have to take matters into our own hands. That was sort of the theory, I think, behind the bin Laden raid, which obviously involved the insertion of ground forces into Pakistan, which they were not happy about. I think it's an unsettled matter of law at this point. And what I was kind of struck by as I was writing this story about this a couple of years ago was that the administration had made no response to this. They had not come out and given a vocal defense of why we think this is legal. About a month after I wrote my story, they did that. And they're basically using self-defense doctrine. They're saying, their attitude is, well, it's in our self-defense. It's why it's permissible here. I don't know if that holds in Yemen. I don't know if that holds in any number of places where we might be using drones in the future. We have surveillance drones over Syria now. They're not firing on anything. They're just collecting information. But you asked the great question. If a Chinese drone goes over Washington, what is our response going to be? Obviously, it's going to be to shoot it down. And we're going to view that as absolutely a provocation, But it shreds this fine line between espionage and combat. And nations spy on each other, right? But you put, a Chinese drone over Washington, we're not going to ask, are you just taking pictures? That's where you cross that line, and I think that's where things can start to escalate very quickly.
To kind of follow up, about a year ago there was a contrails photograph off the coast of California that looked to a lot of people like a missile having been fired. They couldn't tell where it was from. A lot of people just brushed it off as an airplane contrail, but a lot of people said it looked an awful, people who are familiar with rocket contrails said it looked like this is right after we announced we were about to do something against North Korea or against China.
Right.
So the theory among, let's say, non-skeptics was that it was a response by the Chinese to say, if you dare to do what you're threatening to do, we're just letting you know we have submarines off your shore, kind of thing. Could you comment on what your impression of that contrail was? Do you know?
If I remember correctly, I remember the pictures, and I think one of the explanations was that it was somehow a tilting of the lens, and it was actually a plane contrail. And to be completely honest with you, I did not investigate that. I was as intrigued by it as I'm sure you are. But regardless, I think that the point that you just made, I think, is true. The Chinese are not going to simply sit by and watch us, build up strategic counters to them and do nothing about it. Whether it was a missile strike, I don't know. It's a great mystery. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thinking about the hardware, both for drones and the hardware used in accessing cyberspace. We're talking about processors, chips, LCD screens, plasma screens, most of which are manufactured outside the U.S., probably in the Pacific Rim. In the diplomatic tensions that could lead up to a shooting war, the suppliers of that kind of hardware might say we're not going to export it to the U.S. anymore. So the cutting-edge technology that we're depending on, could it be taken away from us because we're not producing it domestically?
I presume that could be a possibility, not unlike the Iranians saying we're not going to sell you our oil. Interestingly, the Pentagon right now takes that question that you ask and actually sees it from a different perspective, which is how do we trust that the circuits and the processors that are being manufactured in China and elsewhere aren't being embedded with technology to spy on us, more or less, or how they're not being turned against us. And this is often referred to as supply chain security. And so there are programs now in the Defense Department trying to get their arms around how do we sort of, from a logistics standpoint, right, monitor these things from their creation to their eventual installation in U.S. systems. To me, it's one of those sort of dizzying problems, how in the world are you possibly going to control that and prevent that from happening? I do not know the answer to it, but you raise also a very interesting possibility of, if this escalated, could, the Chinese say, we're not going to build your iPad anymore, or we're not going to build this semiconductor anymore. Possibly, yeah. These are interdependent systems, as you point out.
Well, I'd like to ask you to go as far as you dare in answering this question, because you probably have seen shadows. It isn't like the Pentagon to be wholly defensive. And I wonder what you have seen or heard that you can talk about that relates to offensive use of cyber strategies by the by the Pentagon, by the NSA.
Sure. I read a bit about this in the book, The Watchers. The meeting that I talked about at the very beginning of the talk, where Mike McConnell goes into Bush and he wants to talk about Iraq and operations in Iraq, and he solves the problem in 15 minutes, that was a cyber offense. McConnell actually wanted to use the NSA and its hacking techniques to penetrate the computers, and particularly the cell phone networks of the insurgents in Iraq, and break into their systems and essentially send them fake text messages, among other things, to make them think that they were communicating with each other. And, you know, as it was described to me, there's a message of, you know, hey, meet me at the corner of, you know, 5th and whatever, and when you get there, you know, it's one of our guys. I know from talking to people who were involved in what's called information operations in Iraq that, you know, the military was very interested in trying to find the sources of jihadi propaganda sites. To do that, you kind of, you know, imagine hacking through the system to find out who the person is that is posting those images and those videos, and then deal with them, as the military would say, in kinetic fashion. But so far, I think actually, as I've been able to figure it out anyway, our cyber offense has actually been pretty limited. I mean, the two scenarios I just described are pretty rudimentary. I mean, they're sort of, you know, hacking that gets you to the point of, you know, kind of classic deception games and whatnot. I haven't seen, and I'm not saying it hasn't happened, any evidence that we've, you know, shut off the lights someplace else. I presume that we are looking very closely at how to do that, and have been for a long time. But there's one sort of public example that I think does constitute what I would say, you know, as close as you're going to get to an act of cyber warfare, and that's the Stuxnet virus. So Stuxnet was, and I, you know, there's no confirmation on who built it. I personally think it was us and the Israelis working together. Was a piece of software that was designed specifically to get inside the systems that control centrifuges at a nuclear facility in Iran, and was so specific that it actually spread through networks, going around and looking for the particular equipment, and was targeting it, I believe, by serial number, so that it wouldn't see these devices elsewhere in the world. It would go, nope, not it, not it, not it, not it, not it. And when it got to the one in Iran, it went, it. And it infected it. And then the reporting on this is that got in, took over the systems, and made the centrifuge spin out of control and go offline and explode. You know, is that so different than dropping a bomb on the facility? You know, I guess I'd leave that to lawyers, but to my mind, it's pretty similar. So in a sense, if you like, one of the first real acts of, I think, if not verifiable acts of cyber war, but ones that we know a lot about, that would probably be the Stuxnet virus. And I have strong suspicions that we were involved in that, if not consenting partners to that.
I just wondered if you would comment on, I've been reading a lot of articles recently about private drones that are going to be owned by corporations, maybe individuals. I know a nice RC hobby site where I can buy a mock-up U2 model.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you would comment on that. And the other thing I wondered about is, I think drones are often used to target individuals, or at least I'm reading how they take out this terrorist and that terrorist. Could drones be used maybe by a private group or whatever to take out the people that run the power grid rather than to take out the power grid itself? So
Sure.
I'm just wondering, particularly about the private zone.
Yeah, the answer to the first question actually leads to an answer to the second one. So there are sites like DIY drones, do-it-yourself drones. That one, I believe, is the one that Chris Anderson, who's the editor of Wire Magazine, runs. That they're hobbyists. They get together and they build these things, and they're really cool. And they're very, very interesting. Hobbyists, I think, right now, as long as they're not using them for commercial purposes in the U.S., can fly drones below 400 feet. There was a case of a guy out in Los Angeles that was using a drone to go up and take pictures for real estate marketing, and he was shut down by the LAPD because he was making money off of it. So hobbyists can use them. Obama just signed the FAA Reauthorization Act, which requires that by 2015 the FAA has to prepare to integrate drones into domestic U.S. airspace. What you're going to see when that happens is all kinds of corporations building drones and all kinds of companies buying them for really kind of a dizzying number of applications. The ones that people talk a lot about in the near term are agriculture. So using drones to do like crop dusting, crop monitoring, animal herding. There's law enforcement applications. They'd be very good for SWAT teams. I talked to one researcher for a piece I wrote recently who's looking at how do you develop a drone that's basically built like a spider, and it would sort of crawl up the outside wall of a home and get on the windowsill with a camera and look inside the house to see like where the hostages were. You could imagine using that for all kinds of things. And this is where then it goes to your second question. I mean, I've been sitting on this task force, as I alluded to earlier, where we're just starting to talk about, the moral and the legal and the ethical dimensions of this. And I mean, and this was a room of about 20 people, lawyers, scholars, journalists, and we were just kind of baffled by it, to be honest with you, because why couldn't somebody use a drone domestically for some nefarious purpose? Of course they could. I mean, why couldn't a terrorist load, a chemical weapon onto a drone and fly it into a football stadium? I mean, we worried about it with crop dusters. Why couldn't it be done with drones? Absolutely could. And I think this is just now starting to sort of surface in these sort of, policy circles. But what's so interesting about it is it's just common sense. I mean, everybody understands how this could be a problem. And we just don't have the capacity in law right now in this country to address that. And I think what you're going to see is as we're approaching this 2015 date with the FAA and the integration and the drones and all that, there's going to have to be a lot of work done before then about, I don't know if it's regulating them, if it's monitoring the air, I don't know. But it's going to be a real issue, I think.
I'm curious about the need for geographical closeness to your target. We have bases all over the world that we are able to launch drone strikes or whatever from, and surveillance, I guess. I don't know that much about it, but it seems to me that somewhere along the line, it takes a certain amount of energy to project your force and to move yourself to where you want to be. And there are limitations on how much energy you can put on a little tiny plane or a big plane or whatever. What's the role of geography going to be, and our friendships and our relationships with Germany or Israel, or being able to put a aircraft carrier in the Middle East? What's the role of that in this future world that you're describing?
Sure. You've put your finger on one of the big sort of limitations of drones, which is their range, right? I mean, so there are drones the size of hummingbirds in the prototype stage. They can't necessarily fly for hours on end because you can't put a big battery on them. A lot of these sort of small drones, actually, the biggest thing on them is the battery pack. I think that the way to answer that question is the drones have the same kinds of limitations about range and flight time and all that as a normal plane would. So where the military has been starting to think about going is to counter that. In the surveillance realm, there's a great interest right now in building airships or blimps that you could basically put aloft that would stay there for weeks, months, and provide wide area persistent surveillance of an area. I imagine that probably, around about 2017 or so, you'll probably see that happening with law enforcement. There's a lot of research into solar-powered drones with very large wingspans that could stay aloft for a long time. There has been a lot of talk with this, the Air Force has awarded a contract in the past year for a whole new fleet of refueling tankers. These are the ones that allow our planes and our bombers to stay aloft for a long time and refuel during mission. Those need to be compatible with drones. So you'll probably see long-range drones at some point. I imagine you'll probably see drone tankers at some point. So I think the answer to the question is it's only a matter of finding a way to overcome their limitations the way we have with traditional aircraft, and probably coming up with all kinds of new research into longer-lasting batteries and fuel cells and the like. I mean, the military is a great consumer of energy and a great innovator into energy research. Yeah.
You've been talking about cyber terror as something that could scare the living daylights out of us, for which we don't have good defense. You haven't mentioned bioterror at all. Is that something that you could offer us some thoughts on as far as what's been thought about in the highest levels?
Yeah. I mean, I think it is still as much of a concern in theory as it was after 9/11 and even in some circles before 9/11. My sense is that you still do hear a lot of responses, especially in Homeland Security, about countering nuclear, chemical, bio, nuke, chem, bio. My personal perspective on this, and having reported on it for a long time, is that a chemical attack would actually be a lot easier to contain and recover from than a biological attack. There was a lot of concern over things like dirty bombs and the like, and chemical, releases of chemical gases and plumes and all that. There's a lot of talk of that after 9/11. That could be something that was fairly localized. A biological outbreak, in terms of an infectious disease that spreads and then people get on airplanes and it spreads and spreads again, that is, a much greater consequence, I think. The simple answer is, it's still a very big concern. It's still scary. I think that the investigation into the anthrax mailings, I don't think that it made people less concerned in the government about it, but I think that is still pretty fresh in the memory of a lot of people in security circles, that something like that could potentially happen again. I don't think it's something that people have taken their eye off of. I hope not. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you for your attention. It was great. Oh.
You can see why Shane is very, very worthy to join that esteemed club of Ford Journalism Prize winners. We have a set of pens for you with the signature of Gerald Ford, the president we represent, and we thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much.
This is terrific.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Before our reception and a chance for you to ask more questions. For those of you who are U of M football fans, please mark your calendars for a couple of weeks from now, Thursday, March 8th. We're going to be showing a documentary called Black and Blue, the story of Gerald Ford, Willis Ward, and a 1934 Michigan-Georgia Tech game. For those of you who don't know the name, Willis Ward was an African-American player on the team at that time, and because of rules and policies in the South, was not allowed to join the field and join his teammates here at the Big House. It was a story that's been known to a few for a while, but not really broadly known, and President Ford didn't talk about it a lot, but Willis Ward was his traveling roommate on the team. They were lifelong friends. Mr. Ward became a judge in Detroit, a very distinguished individual, and we will have the producer here, Brian Kruger, who produced the film, author of the text, Buddy Morehouse, and we hope former Senator Buzz Thomas of Detroit, who is Willis Ward's grandson. So we've shown it at the museum, and it's a wonderful film, runs just an hour, and you'll have a chance to talk to, right after the Oscars, you'll have a chance to talk to a producer about making the film. But if you like football, it's a really interesting story. Fielding Yost, of great fame, played a big role in that. So if you're a Michigan history fan, and football in particular, you'll enjoy that on the 8th. To the end of March, at the 28th, we are hosting journalist Marvin Kalb, coming to us from the Brookings Institution in Washington. He has a new book called Haunting Legacy, Vietnam and the American Presidency from Ford to Obama. And that's a real honor for us to have someone of Mr. Kalb's standing. And then on Wednesday, April 4th, we're having Frank Zarb, who was energy czar in the Ford administration, talking about energy, our biggest policy failure. He's a very bright man, very knowledgeable, and that program is co-sponsored with Varnum Law and also the Ford School of Public Policy. So we enjoy and invite you to come to the lobby, enjoy a reception, talk to Shane Harris, and thank you for coming tonight. Glad to have you.